In the beginning of last season, I was a McHale defender on my blog because I wasn't familiar with his coaching, and I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt rather than jumping to conclusions. Now that I've witnessed McHale for an entire season, it's crystal clear to me that he's not fit to be an NBA coach. And after seeing him this season, it's evident that he hasn't learned anything from his first season. He still has the same exact issues that he struggled with all last season. But before I get to all the negatives, I want to point out the things I do like about McHale. In the beginning of last season, I really liked the game plan that McHale had for this young Rockets team. An uncomplicated, free-flowing offense. I love McHale's emphasis on ball movement, player movement, as well as running after every possession. He also appeared to have the trust of the players, although I think that trust is waning a bit this year, and I don't think Harden really respects McHale because he often goes off on his own. But I think a lot of superstars override the coach, so this is not too big of a deal. Anyway, these are all positives about McHale, but the essential question to ask when evaluating McHale is whether or not you think any average coach would have been able to do these things, or is this unique to McHale? Here's where I stand on this question. On the uncomplicated, free-flowing offense, I think any coach would have been able to come up with this. From an X's and O's perspective, there's really not much to it. On the ball movement, player movement, I think this is something that every coach emphasizes, but not every coach can actually get their players to do it. Rockets have players who are unselfish and willing to share the ball, so that makes McHale's job much easier. I would give McHale some credit for this, but with McHale's free-flowing offense, it is often very confusing to players about where they should move to on the floor. So I pretty much come out on this with giving McHale a tiny bit of credit for ball movement and player movement. On running after made baskets, this is something that I give McHale the most credit for, because this is something that every coach tells their players to do, but not many coaches have the patience to keep preaching it over and over until it is ingrained in the players. McHale did this, and he did a good job of this earlier and midway through last season, but I think even he lost some patience with it during the latter part of last season. The problem is that even though McHale preaches running after made baskets, I deduct points for McHale's poor management and usage of players' minutes, which makes it very hard for players to run after every possession because he has tired them out by playing them way too many minutes without rest. So at the end of the day, McHale gets a pretty good amount of credit for this, but less than you would think because of his poor management of players' minutes. On McHale's rapport with his players, McHale is often called a player's coach, and it appears that many of the players do enjoy playing for him. They have good rapport with him. But the thing is, players have good rapport with a good number of coaches simply because of the nature of the coach-player relationship. So McHale just gets some credit for this. Rockets are full of high-caliber guys, so I think pretty much any coach can come in and elicit a similar level of respect and camaraderie. So again, McHale gets less credit than you would think because it's easy to have rapport when you're coaching a bunch of high-caliber, high-character guys. Overall, the positive things that McHale provides, I think pretty much any average coach can provide to a similar extent. Maybe McHale does this slightly better than the average coach. If McHale performed every other aspect of his coaching duties at an average level, then I wouldn't have too much of a problem with McHale. So this is why I was a McHale defender earlier in the season. I hadn't seen him coach long enough to fairly evaluate how he performs during in-game situations. All the positive things McHale does that I mentioned above has more to do with off-the-court coaching duties, such as providing an overall offensive scheme as well as player communications. My attitude back then was that there are better coaches out there, but McHale is good enough. Put it this way, if Morey and Les thought there was someone else that they could bring on who can do a better job, I wouldn't have complained, but at the same time I wasn't calling for his head. But after seeing him for a full season, I was calling for his head at the end of last season, and I haven't changed my mind about McHale. In fact, I feel even more strongly about the fact that McHale just needs to be relieved of his duties as a coach. Period. If you're incompetent at your job, you get fired. I know Les and Maury are reluctant to fire McHale because he was brought in when they were in their development mode and had to deal with a lot of upheaval that all of that entails. So they feel they owe it to McHale to give him a shot at coaching a contending team. His showing so far this season makes it clear to me that he hasn't learned a damn thing, and he has been responsible for the Rockets underperforming their capabilities. McHale has done nothing but hurt the Rockets, and it's irresponsible for Les and Maury to let him continue his destruction of a very, very talented team. Perhaps the most talented team the Rockets have had in a very, very long time. Now, I have nothing against McHale as a person, and he went through a lot last season. I also think he is great at communicating with his players. I'd be fine with keeping him on as some sort of motivational coach or as a trainer for Dwight Howard. Like I said before, if McHale was just an average coach, I'd be fine with keeping him on. But the problem is McHale performs below average, or well below average, on so many critical aspects of coaching, from player evaluation to player rotation, and has committed an alarming number of in-game mistakes. He also lacks any sort of end-game strategy. Frankly, the Rockets have the worst inbounding plays, if you can actually call them that, and end-of-game strategies that I have seen. Every other coach seems to be able to whip up end-of-game inbound plays that easily frees up their shooter for high percentage shots, whereas McHale's end-of-game strategies amounts to giving the ball to Harden while everyone stands around, and Harden puts up a highly contested shot from 5 feet beyond three-point line. It is said that players lose blowouts and coaches lose close games. Well, the Rockets have lost so many close games already this season, and last season was no different, so it should be no surprise that we're losing so many close games this season. So nothing has changed on that front, and that in and of itself should be a fireable offense. But the thing is, the negatives on McHale are numerous. However, before I get to that, I want to address those who might argue that I'm not being fair to McHale because I'm not looking at all the situations in which McHale made good decisions. My response to this is that in the situations that McHale made good decisions, any average coach would have made those very same decisions. In fact, I can only think of a couple of decisions from last season that McHale made that were good and could be considered unique to McHale. One of those decisions was going with Beverly in the Magic's game last season and benching Lin. But even I, as a Lin fan, would have done that in that game because Beverly really had it going and was pretty much single-handedly responsible for Rockets winning that game. So I think any average coach would have benched Lin in favor of Beverly in that specific game. The only other time is McHale's unconventional lineup change during the playoffs to go small. That was very courageous, and I don't think any old coach would have done that, so props to McHale for that. But making two good decisions isn't enough. Again, if McHale was just an average coach, this would be fine, but he's well below average on so many critical aspects of coaching, and I'll get to those in detail now. I mentioned the lack of end-of-game strategies earlier. I think this is pretty much obvious if you've watched any Rockets games, so I'm not going to dwell on this point too much. If you don't see how awful the Rockets are when the game is on the line, and how this is 100% McHale's fault, then I really don't know what to tell you. I just assume everyone knows this as fact. The most recent example being the Mavs game, where the Rockets had a chance to tie the game and ended up giving the ball to Harden without being able to free him up, and Harden ended up shooting a highly contested shot 4 feet from the three-point line. But the most atrocious example of this is during the Sixers game when the Rockets had 18 seconds left to win the game, and Garcia put up a very unnecessary and highly contested three with 12 seconds left on the shot clock. When I saw that ball leave Garcia's hands, it was like seeing a unicorn. I couldn't believe my eyes. That was easily the dumbest thing I've ever seen in basketball. Of course, I do blame Garcia for doing the stupidest thing imaginable, but McHale is also to blame for the insane inbounding play, if you can even call it a play. He drew up a play that is meant for when you're down by 3 with less than 7 seconds on the shot clock. But the Rockets had 18 seconds left and the game was tied. The only play that should have been called when the game is tied with 18 seconds left on the clock is to have your primary ball handler, in this case Lin, dribble the ball at the top of the arc and run down the clock until there's 7 seconds left or so, and you either run like a pick and roll or something to make something happen. Doesn't really matter. Of course, if Harden had been in the game, that's exactly what McHale would have done. But McHale doesn't trust Lin for completely irrational reasons. He opts to run some crazy last-second play to give Garcia a contested, unnecessary 3. This is beyond insane. And that should have been a fireable offense in and of itself. It was so bad. That was the worst coaching I've ever seen, and I'm not even exaggerating. Everything about that play was beyond stupidity, but it serves as a perfect representation for McHale's utter incompetence when the game is on the line. McHale is also probably the worst when it comes to managing his players' minutes. The Rockets currently have 2 players in the top 5 in the NBA in terms of minutes played. It's Harden and Parsons, of course. McHale has only a few players that he trusts, and he plays these guys to death without any regard for how player fatigue can be a detriment to the team. I think the reason McHale overplays guys he trusts is that he knows he's an incapable coach. So he's relying on his players' talents to cover up his deficiencies as a coach. All you have to do is look at the box score of any Rockets games, and it will be clear how unbalanced McHale's rotation is versus that of other coaches. Going into this season, the Rockets have one of the deepest benches in the NBA, but McHale acts like we have the worst bench in the NBA. McHale overplays a few guys, then ends up yanking all the other guys in and out of the lineup, messing up the rhythm and disturbing any sort of chemistry or consistency in his lineups. His lack of trust in every player not named Harden, Parsons, Howard, or Beverly kills the confidence of all the other players on the team, causing them to underperform their capabilities. It seems like McHale panics anytime one of his trusted guys isn't on the floor, and whenever the Rockets give up a few points when his trusted guys aren't in, he panics and replaces the lineup with his trusted guys. As a result, his trusted guys don't get the necessary rest that they need to finish games, and this is another reason, among many, why the Rockets are so terrible when the game is on the line late in games. The season has barely started, and McHale's overuse of Harden has caused Harden to already get banged up. I also think that McHale's overuse of Harden causes Harden to make poor decisions and turn the ball over due to fatigue. Of course, a lot of Harden's turnovers are him making bad decisions or trying to draw fouls. As a coach, how you use your players and when you use them is perhaps the most important job you have. It's the thing that gives you direct control of the game, so McHale fails miserably at perhaps the most important part of his job. McHale is awful at evaluating his players and recognizing his players' talents. Just to give you an example of how bad McHale is at evaluating his players, he favored Douglas over Beverly, even though I recognized Beverly's talents in the very first game I saw Beverly play. And I even called Beverly an elite on-ball defender, even though he was a complete no-name at the time. It takes a lot for McHale to change his views. I think this is partly why Morey traded away the power forward lineup to force McHale to play the other power forwards on the team last season. It also took injuries to Harden and Parsons for McHale to discover that Garcia is someone who deserves to be in the rotation last season. Even though I kept screaming on my blog to play Garcia after I observed Garcia for just a few minutes, I recognized right away that Garcia is an all-around better player than Delfino, that he can actually defend very well and is more selective with his shots. T. Jones is another player that McHale took a long time to trust and play any minutes last season, even though he was stellar in the preseason, in the Summer League, and in the D-League. And last season, I also kept screaming for McHale to use James Anderson, but Anderson was completely forgotten by McHale because it was unacceptable to McHale that Harden would not be on the floor every single minute of every game. It's fitting that Anderson had a career game against the Rockets this season, showing once again that McHale failed to see talent in yet another player. As a coach, you're the closest to the players, so there's no excuse for not having a deep level of understanding of their capabilities and how to use them. McHale seems to only see his players through his preconceptions of them, and it takes McHale a very, very long time, if ever, to break free of these preconceptions and see the players as they are. As in the case with Lin, McHale is still unable to break free of his preconceptions of Lin, but that's a whole other story. Yet this is another clear example of McHale's utter failure at evaluating his players' talents and knowing how to get the best out of his players. McHale really has no clear plan of how to run the team consistently. McHale is a very slow learner who seems to be oblivious to what works and what doesn't work. The Rockets played their best ball back in December of last season when the talk about Lin and Harden coexisting really started heating up, and McHale started really focusing on making it work. After Lin had his breakout game against the Knicks, McHale finally let Lin be the primary floor general, and he also staggered Lin's and Harden's minutes. The result was one of the best stretches the Rockets had last season, with blowouts against a very strong Grizzlies team as well as the Bulls. Inexplicably, after this winning streak, McHale completely went away from the strategy of having Lin be the primary floor general and staggering Lin's and Harden's minutes, and seemed to stop trying to make the Lin-Harden synergy work altogether. He stopped staggering Lin's and Harden's minutes and went back to having Harden be the primary floor general. That resulted in a series of losses for the Rockets midway through the season. McHale's usage of Lin, Harden, and Beverly last season was so backwards, it was laughable. Harden is on the floor pretty much 100% of the time, so there's no chance for Lin to be on the floor without Harden. And he even inexplicably sat both Lin and Harden and let Beverly be the only ball handler on the floor. Lin is rarely on the floor without Harden, and when Harden is on the floor with Beverly, Beverly is the primary floor general, but when Lin is on the floor with Harden, Harden is the primary floor general. This is an insane strategy and completely backwards. But I think McHale's misuse of Lin has a lot to do with the McHale-Lin dynamics that I discussed in a very long video entitled McHale is just a Jeremy Lin doubter, nothing more, nothing less, which I'll include in a link in the description below. Of course, McHale's misuse of Lin continues this season, even though McHale had the benefit of observing Lin for an entire season and has seen tremendous improvements in Lin throughout the preseason and thus far in the regular season. McHale seems to go out of his way to misuse Lin and put as many obstacles in the way of Lin's success as he can. And he is intent on getting Lin out of the starting lineup at all costs, even though there are good arguments to be made for the need to have Lin in the starting lineup now that they have Howard on the team. What is so irrational to me and speaks to the McHale-Lin dynamics that I talk about in the video I just mentioned is McHale's token response to reporters' very valid skepticism of the Twin Towers lineup. McHale's token response is that he believes in having his best 5 players in the starting lineup. This response is so wrong on so many levels and is actually a Lin hater statement. There are no good reasons for having Ashik and Howard share the floor, whereas there are plenty of good reasons for having Lin and Howard share the floor. Having Ashik and Howard on the floor together is detrimental, whereas having Lin and Harden on the floor together isn't that bad. I mean, they did it for an entire season and the Rockets managed to go to the playoffs. And there's a good argument to be made that Lin is actually more needed in the starting lineup this season and last season now that they have Howard on the team. Also, Howard is objectively better than Ashik, and Lin is objectively better than Beverly. So why is it that McHale tried so hard to keep Ashik in the starting lineup and goes out of his way to keep Lin out of the starting lineup? The only reason is the McHale-Lin dynamics. By having Lin come off the bench, McHale can get away with benching Lin in the fourth quarter without too much protest. And this is a key reason why McHale won't even dare test out having Lin in the starting lineup. He doesn't want to risk fans seeing that Lin coming off the bench or Lin being in the starting lineup really doesn't make that much of a difference strategically for the team. There's really no clear reason for Jeremy to come off the bench, at least not the way that McHale has been using Lin off the bench. Lin still ends up playing with Harden quite a bit, so the whole purpose of having Lin come off the bench is pretty much nullified. And I don't buy the fact that we need Beverly's defense to start off games because Lin is just as good of an overall defender as Beverly is. So that's just another bogus rationale. Beverly is an elite on-ball defender, but Lin is a very good overall defender. If you don't believe this, then at least you can agree that Lin is not a defensive liability. So there's no real need to have Beverly in the starting lineup for defensive purposes. It would make sense if Lin is a defensive liability, but he isn't. So the only real reason Lin is not in the starting lineup is because McHale wants to make it easier for him to bench Lin whenever he sees fit. Another baffling example of McHale's misuse of Lin or complete lack of understanding of Lin's game is that he inexplicably finds it necessary to always pair Jeremy Lin with either Harden or Beverly, as if Lin needs help handling the ball, when it's clear that Lin can run the show by himself. McHale's intent to turn one of the best pick-and-roll point guards into a pure shooting guard. I'd like to see a lineup of Lin without either Harden or Beverly. For example, have Lin, Garcia, Caspi, Demo, and Ashik. I've yet to see that lineup on the floor. I'm not saying that that's the best lineup for Lin. It isn't at all, actually. But I'd still like to see it. McHale does all sorts of experiments with the lineups, but has yet to try that lineup because he, for some inexplicably insane reason, thinks Lin needs to play with either Harden or Beverly. And this makes absolutely no sense. This is also another example of how he's nullifying the entire purpose of using Lin as a sixth man. So again, there's no real strategic reason for how McHale is using Lin as a sixth man. The only real reason is simply that McHale doesn't want Lin to be in the starting lineup, and so he can get away with benching Lin more easily. Even if you're not a Lin fan and you're just a Rockets fan, misusing Lin the way McHale has been misusing Lin actually hurts the Rockets because they don't have a clear point guard presence on the team. And this year, they really need to have a clear point guard presence on the team with Howard on the team. The crazy thing is that McHale actually has the perfect point guard in Jeremy Lin now that they have Howard, but McHale doesn't let Lin practice with Howard. This is what a lot of fans miss, and another obstacle in a series of obstacles that McHale has put in Lin's path for completely irrational reasons. You have one of the best pick-and-roll point guards and the best pick-and-roll big, and you don't even try to see if they can work together. In fact, you go out of your way to make them not work together. I see a lot of fans deride Lin in the forums when Lin turns the ball over in an attempt to feed Howard. What these fans miss is that Lin actually isn't on Howard's team during practices, so Lin doesn't have much of a chance to develop chemistry with Howard. In fact, a lot of the lineups that Lin plays with in games is actually not the lineup he plays with in practice, so Lin has to sort of figure things out on the fly during the games. Again, a lot of fans miss this. This is another obstacle that McHale has put in the way of Lin's success. This was very evident in the Mavs game because Ashik was thrown into the lineup, and that was the first time that lineup played together in a game. All the unnecessary obstacles that McHale has put in front of Lin from day one, forcing Lin in all sorts of uncomfortable situations, has hurt this team. Rather than embracing Lin and playing to Lin's strengths, McHale has done everything in his power to marginalize Lin, and that hurt the team last season and is still hurting the team this season and will continue to hurt the team. We had another example of this in the most recent Mavs game. Even though Lin had an off night, I still think the Rockets could have used Lin in the fourth quarter when they couldn't find their offense. If McHale had just put Lin in with the starting lineup like he has every single game this season, Lin could have helped the team spark some offense in the fourth quarter with Howard and Harden drawing a lot of the attention. Even with the level of consistency that Lin has displayed so far, being perhaps the most consistent Rockets player, McHale still inexplicably will not accept Lin as one of his trusted players. Even though McHale has done the most damage to Jeremy Lin, he has also been a detriment to the Rockets team overall due to all of the reasons I stated earlier. And because of this, Morey and Les need to man up and do the right thing If they're serious about the Rockets being a contender, they need to get rid of the weakest link on the team, and that's Kevin McHale, and possibly some of his cronies. I don't know how anyone who watches Rockets games consistently can't see how awful of a coach Kevin McHale is. It would be fine if he was just an average coach, because I think this team is good enough to succeed with an average coach. The problem is McHale is getting in the way of bringing out the best in this great group of guys. He is the reason the Rockets have been underperforming well below their capabilities. There are so many other reasons for McHale's incompetence, but I only wanted to point out the major top-level ones for the sake of time in this video. If you want more examples, I've included links to blog posts in the description below. You can judge for yourself whether or not I've made the case for McHale's dismissal. As usual, give me the comments below, thumbs up, thumbs down, share the videos, and please subscribe. Thanks.